Hello my friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with yet another video using Simon Says stamps, mushroom stems, wafer dies. The ideas just don't stop, so I'm just going to keep making videos and cards using this die set because I love it. So, to start off with, oh, and for those that aren't aware, when I get on little obsessions like this, I end up making playlists containing all the videos. I will have a link to that playlist at the end of this video with all the other videos I've done so far, and I will just continue to add to it as I get things made and posted. So that'll be at the end to check out if you guys want to. And yeah, to start off with, I've got the mushroom stems wafer dies, and I am die cutting them from Distress Heavy Stock in KRAFT. Love this cardstock. It just... there's something about it. The way everything, just the way it looks, because I've said it. I love KRAFT cardstock, and this is like KRAFT cardstock on steroids, really. It's darker, it's got a little bit more texture to it, and it can handle like water and all the mixed media techniques, all the things. So I ran the wafer die through my little EMPRESS mini die cut machine with those wafer dies and the KRAFT heavy stock, and just die cut a nice little stack of all of these mushrooms. Once I was done that, I'm going to stick these all to just one of my stick and stamp mats just to hold the pieces so that I can color them. And to color them, I'm using Distress watercolor pencils. That is the palette you see on screen. They do not come like this. I have a video that I did back in like the fall, whenever these were released. And I did an entire video showing how I used the shavings of the watercolor pencils and made this palette. And I will have a link to that video at the end of this video as well, if you're interested, because this is how I prefer to use the Distress watercolor pencils. This is just, for me, again, it's like chef's kiss because they're creamy, and I just use my little water brush and they're great. And there's something about the Distress watercolor pencils on this KRAFT heavy stock that's like, I don't know, it is just perfection, and I love it. So that's literally all I did. I stuck all the pieces to the stick and stamp mat, and then I just swirl my little water brush. This is also like a little Tim Holtz Distress water brush, and same thing, I have had this thing for years. I'm not even sure how many years old this little water brush is, and it's just a favorite. And it's stained and icky, and I don't care. It works. So I just swirl the brush into the little wells. You could also use, touch the wet brush to the pencils if you didn't want to do the whole palette thing. Would other watercolor pencils work for this? Possibly. I don't know. These are the only ones I've kind of been using because I just really like them, and because they're in distress colors. That's the biggest bonus. But if you've got watercolor pencils, try them. Try them on darker cardstocks, or like the KRAFT heavy stock or black cardstock, etc. Just see how they show up, and it could totally work. Why not? So I also don't have my palette labeled. I get asked that a lot as well, like what specific order. I can pretty much name every single color just by looking at them. With the watercolor pencils, it's a little like smidge different here and there, but I've just never bothered. I just put them in like a rough sort of rainbow order and stuck them in the palette. I didn't think about it too hard, I just like using them. So I painted the stems and what is like the underside of these mushrooms with just a mixture of various colors, like some browns, and I think I used like antique linen at one point as well, and just literally just slapped on the color, because that's also what I like about how these look on the KRAFT heavy stock is if I slap on the color and I don't think about it too much, and then I'll get like little variations in darker areas and lighter areas and all that sort of a thing. So for the tops of the mushrooms, I just used a combo of reds. Wasn't really thinking too hard about it. Just swirled my brush, slapped it on, added a bit more, and just continued until I have all of them painted. And once I do all of this painting, I let them dry, which didn't take very long because I don't use a whole lot of water with this. So it like this didn't have to be on the KRAFT HEAVYSTOCK because I wasn't doing like, you know, really heavy inking and water techniques or anything like that. But I purposely chose the KRAFT HEAVYSTOCK because it just, there's something about the color of it. So after I was done all my little bits of painting on these and they were dry, then it's just time to assemble. And to do that, I just use my KRAFT tacky glue. I talked about this, I think in the last video I did of these. Like, it would be really cute to pop up like the tops with like foam tape and like really make these dimensional. And I haven't even done that yet. I've done many videos using this. And again, like I said, so many ideas. So I adhered everything together with KRAFT tacky glue. Just popped them all into place. I've just sped this up in editing because it's kind of same old, and I am feeling very repetitive with some of these steps because it's like I've shown how to assemble the mushrooms like a bajillion times now. But anyway, adhered them all together. And then after I get them adhered, of course I'm going to add splatter because that is just what one must do. So got them all assembled first, and then I'm going to stick them all into my splat box. And I'm going to use white gouache to add the splatter to them. So stuck them all in there, and then I just take my white gouache, I stick that on one of my little plastic palettes here, and then I use my little go-to splatter brush, this Royal and Langnickel Zen fan brush that just makes the perfect splatter. I love it. So added just a little bit of water to thin out the gouache enough so that it splatters properly, and then heavily splattered all of these, like just all over. Started kind of with the tops and then just added it to all of it because there's never too much in my opinion. So added all the splatter. After I did that, I am going to create what originally, you know, it was an idea in my head for the backgrounds, and then it didn't turn out the way I wanted. So I'm going to detour, but let me explain how it came to be. So I'm using HEAVYSTOCK again, but this time I'm using like the original like manila cream color because HEAVYSTOCK comes in the KRAFT. This cream color was like the original. There's white, which I also love, and black. So with this one, I'm applying distress ink directly to it. And first off, with this specific technique, it helps if your ink pads are fully saturated. You want to find out if your ink pads need to be re-inked, just apply them direct to paper. These ones need to be re-inked. I've been saying this for a while. I need to like literally sit down and re-ink probably every single one of my little distress ink cubes. Because some of these I've had for years and years. Have all the re-inkers. Just need to do it. But anyway, it helps if the ink pad is saturated, and then you saturate the cardstock. But again, I was just kind of mucking around. I've known how to do this technique. I can't remember if I've ever shown it in a video, but Tim Holtz showed this years and years ago, and it's always just, it's such a fun one. So I applied distress ink directly to the background, or to the cardstock, and I used peeled paint, forest moss, and a bit of rustic wilderness distress ink. Then I took a stencil. I'm using the tin tile stencil from Simon here. This one came out a couple years ago, whenever. I've used it in several videos too. It's just a favorite. I sprayed the stencil with water and then pressed it onto the background. And then I used paper towel to kind of soak up some of the excess, but I also added a little bit of splatter with the distress sprayer just to get that water droplet look. Then you remove the stencil from the background, and the water, of course, reacts with the distress ink. And the magic really starts to show up more as it dries. So I'm just using my heat tool to speed it up. And like I said, this works a lot better if you saturate the cardstock with the ink first. But it's still a cool technique regardless. The only, like, this was supposed to be the background, but I was like, it was too dark, which is funny because I was wanting to dark, but I'll do that maybe in a future video. And I wasn't feeling it for the background, but I still liked how it turned out. Like, there's something about like the texture I created with the ink pads because they were drier, and then from the stencil and all the things. And I was like, I'm still going to use this. I'm going to die cut it. So that's something you can do. You know, if you've made backgrounds or, you know, panels of things and you're just like, no, like you just don't like it, die cut it. Walk away from it, stick it in a little basket, come back to it later. You never know. But when I die cut this, I was like, oh, this is fun. So this is another very oldie but goodie wafer die set. This came out years ago. I remember this is one of the first like bigger wafer dies I ever bought, which is funny now because I've got a bajillion wafer die sets, and some of them are enormous. But this is the clustered leaves wafer die, and I don't know when this came out, but I remember ordering it years ago, and I've used it in a bunch of videos, and I just love it. So I used that to die cut these panels, and I actually did make a second panel in the exact same way, like applied the inks directly, didn't re-ink my ink pads, and did the same thing just because I loved how much the first one turned out after I die cut it. So these leaves have all this like different shades of green and some texture and the bit of stenciling and all of that. And it's fun. That's all I can say. It's fun. I had fun. So after I was done die cutting them, I'm going to kind of show these a little bit closer up so you guys can kind of see it. It was just, I really liked it. It didn't work for my background for what I wanted, but they worked great for the leaves. Like, look at the texture. How fun. I gotta play some more, and it is on my to-do list. Who knows when I'll get around to it. I gotta re-ink all my distressing cubes. Anyway, another oldie but goodie stencil that I pulled out is the BOHO circle. This one I've used in many videos, and for whatever reason, I'm not sure why, but it's like, the minute I start thinking mixed media, my immediate reaction is to always grab this stencil. I don't ask me why. It's just a thing. But I pulled it out. I have the remaining piece of this heavy stock, and I'm applying Crackle paste over the stencil. This Crackle paste is at the end of its life. I finally used it up. Honestly, this Crackle paste is, I'm not even kidding, at least 7 years old. It's many, many, many years old. It has lasted all these years, and it's just now finally starting to like actually dry out as I'm at the very bottom of the container. So totally worth it. I got my money's worth out of this thing. So I applied that paste, even though it's like really thick and almost dried out. I applied it over the stencil, went and washed my stencil, and let it dry. You can't really see the crackly bits, but in real life they're fabulous. So the stencil paste is dry. And then I just mushed ink pads right onto my work surface because for whatever reason, when I'm like playing more mixed media, I'm way more comfortable with mucking around and making a mess. I don't know. And then my next video, it'll be like, I'm using a glass mat on top of my glass mat to keep things like separate and proper. Again, do as I say, not as I do. And good luck explaining some of my logic. Anyway. I smushed distress inks onto my work surface, and I did selvage patina and some ice spruce because I used that in a recent video, and I was like, ooh, I forgot how nice ice spruce is, and a bit of the peeled paint. And then I just used a wide flat brush, and I just painted it onto this heavy stock. So on top of the stencil, it starts soaking into the little crackly bits, and I just going for it. So then I also am using my Distress watercolor pencil palette. The fun thing with these is because of like the formulation of them, they will sit on top more. Think of them in a sense kind of more like a pigment. You could also use oxide inks. It is a different look, the oxide inks versus the watercolor pencils. But yeah, because I had the watercolor pencil palette like sitting right in front of me, I was like, ooh, I should paint that on top too. So that's what I did. And again, I was just grabbing colors at random, sticking more with like the greeny, bluey, iced sprucey sort of colors so that, it doesn't become pure mud. And just using that wide flat brush and swirling it into I would get it wet, swirl it into the little pan of whatever random color I was choosing, and then painting that onto this background. And yeah, it would kind of gather into some spots around the stencil areas, and some of it, soaks into the little crackly bits. It just layers on top of everything, and again, I was just having fun. There really is something about just sitting and regardless of whether you have like a start to finish card in mind, there is something really therapeutic about doing like just panels, doing just backgrounds, whether it's going to be a card background or whether you're going to die cut it, chop it up into little pieces and adhere it to a scrapbook layout or whatever. It's fun. Like it really is. I don't know. I find it therapeutic. It's like the coloring, really. Same thing. When I'm sitting and coloring, it's therapeutic. All of it is. Anyway, just trying to explain the thought process. So once I was done painting that, I set it aside. And I decided to go just simple with the sentiments. Mostly because all my brain space, I was just like so many random things. And I was like, you know, I just want to use some sentiment strips. So I'm using another oldie but goodie favorite. It was the Simon Says Stamp Thanks sentiment strips. These came out years ago. I've repurchased this a few times because I use it so often. And I trimmed down the sentiments that I wanted with my guillotine trimmer. The background is dry, so I cut it in half because it was originally 8.5 by 5.5, something like that. And so cut it in half so I get 2 card fronts. And then I trimmed it down even a bit more, so it ends up being 3 3/4 by 5, something like that. I wanted it just smaller than what my A2 card base would be so that it gets that framing of the card base. And then, of course, I'm going to add more splatter. They're just, yeah, I was going to say, because it needed more texture. Not like I didn't do like a ton to the leaves and the background. Like there's a ton going on, but you know, they needed splatter. They needed it. All right. That is the rule. Again, like I said in a previous video, I was like, wait a minute, I do make the rules. It's my channel and it's me making stuff. I can do what I want. So put all those pieces into my spot box and added splatter with the white gouache. And it just gives it all that extra something that I love. So went over everything, just on the background, onto the leaves, all the fun things. And with gouache, it just really depends on what you're splattering it over. Like sometimes it'll be very, very white. And if you've done things like distress inks, anything water reactive, sometimes the splatter will absorb that color, so it'll no longer be white. Other times, if you don't add as much water to it, it'll, you know, stay whiter. And honestly, I don't really care either way. The only time I'm usually a little more concerned about that is if I'm doing like specifically like a winter theme card and the splatter is technically meant to be snow. That's the only time I'm a little like, it needs to be more white, because the last thing you want is like oddly colored snow falling down. But even then, honestly, it's all fun, really. So I now have all my die cut pieces. Everything's dry. The splatter's dry. Everything is good. So I'm going to start adhering everything. And on the insides of the cards, I use just the smaller leaf clusters, because I was able, from the panels I had made, I was able to get these larger die cuts, which I'm using on the front. And then there was enough space to get, you know, partial little die cuts. So I used those on the inside of the card with a couple of the smaller mushrooms and then one of the sentiment strips. And then on the card fronts, I had adhered the stenciled Crackle paste mixed media background with just KRAFT tacky glue. And then I adhered the leaf clusters with KRAFT tacky glue as well, stuck them under my big acrylic blocks, let that all dry, and then I flipped them over and cut off the bits that were hanging off the edges of the cards. And then to adhere my little mushrooms, I am using just thin foam squares to give it a little bit of dimension, but also it's just easier to adhere everything because I've got like literally dimension going on with the Crackle paste and the leaf die cuts and whatnot. So I pop all those into place with the foam squares. I did the same thing with the sentiment strips. I did think about like another way you could step that up by adding, I was thinking like the ice spruce distress ink, like blending that or pouncing that on top of these. That would have looked cute too, but I decided again to just keep the sentiments simple. Yeah, just thought process. Anyway, final bit of embellishment, of course. Still added a bit of bling. You could totally skip this or use something a little more not so shiny sparkly, because in real life these are actually way more sparkly. Right now on camera these look a bit more dull, but these are the Pink Fresh Studio Ruby glitter drops, and I love the Pink Fresh glitter drops. I have all the original set I had ordered, and then they've come out with those new ombre ones, and yeah, definitely need to get my hands on those. So sprinkled these around. It just brings out a bit more of the red. So yeah, once I was kind of happy with the placement of them, I adhered them into place with dabs of KRAFT tacky glue, and that's going to finish off the cards. So like I mentioned earlier in the video, I will have a link to my playlist using this wafer die set, and that'll have all the videos in it so far that I have done using it. I will have a link to that Distress Watercolor palette video. I'll link to that so you guys can check that out if you are interested. And I'll also link, I have a Distress Watercolor pencil playlist as well. And I'll keep adding videos as I make them using those pencils. just trying to keep things organized, and hopefully it helps you guys. And always, 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 thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos. Thumbs upping, commenting, legit makes a huge difference, and I very much appreciate it. Subscribe if you haven't. I'd love to have you, and I will see you all very soon in the next one. Bye.